Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, September 20th, where we are continuing our conversation about Frankenstein, our first major Gothic text, and I also wanted to talk a little bit more about paper number 1. But where we left off last class is I had you view the very iconic 1931 James Whale Frankenstein film, which led to the monster movies that we think of today from Universal Studios, such as Dracula. In fact, Dracula came out before Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein was written before Dracula. And, of course, we will also be talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in class as well. But as you noted, the film makes quite a few changes to the novel. Some omissions. This makes sense because a film is approximately an hour and a half. The James Whale version was shorter than that, which was the expectation of film audiences during this time period. Insertions. And whether that's because of the way the plot is constructed, so you know that Frankenstein is written in an epistolary format. In other words, in letters. Not necessarily an easy format to translate over into screen. So that's usually omitted in Frankenstein adaptations, and we usually get a more traditional plot. The happy ending, which was a requirement from Hollywood at the time, that the monster would be destroyed. And that's not necessarily the case with the ending that we get with Mary Shelley. It's much more complex. And Mary Shelley's text as a whole is much more complex. I don't know if when you were watching the movie that you were watching the opening credits carefully, where they said that it was based on an adaptation from a Mrs. Percy Shelley, which I think says everything about gender during the time period as well. That rather than being viewed as an independent unit, Mary Shelley, she's viewed as a Mrs. Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley being the famous romantic poet to whom she was married. And he had the initial suggestion to expand and develop her initial text. And one of the things that the romantic poets are known for is these long-winded descriptions of nature and the natural world and the celebration of the natural world. And while this might seem like filler when we're reading Frankenstein, I'm going to suggest that it's not filler. It's a central part of the text as well. But it was also a convention of the time period. And in fact, and this is a text that I also do in my Women in Literature class, there have been some conversations as to how much text that we can attribute to Mary Shelley if Percy Shelley has some editorial power. I'm not sure the same question would be raised if there was a mix of gender or a change in gender. In other words, if a male had written the text and a female had given editorial commentary. The reality is that all professional authors use editorial commentary. So I don't think that in any way takes away from Mary Shelley's text. Of course, the iconic scene of the creation in the film is one that probably cemented Frankenstein into popular culture. In fact, censors had originally reviewed that scene and had the line, "and now I'm a god," taken out because they thought that it was too extreme. However, there are other changes that just don't seem to make a whole lot of sense, such as some of the name changes of the characters, Victor and Henry in particular. Unless we want to think about the time period in which the film was made, the 1930s. Now, Victor tends to be a very German name, and obviously this was a sensitive time politically. So perhaps the name change could in part be attributed to the idea that Henry sounded much more American than Victor. So this leads to a certain level of confusion when watching the film. As I've suggested, think of the film as a separate entity, a separate story, if you will. Of course, in many ways, it's just as important as Mary Shelley's novel. It's certainly probably more well-known. I suggest if you haven't had an opportunity to watch the parody Young Frankenstein, that you do so because it's a wonderful takeoff of the Frankenstein film. And of course, the film provides us with justifications that we don't necessarily get in the novel. The sense of an abnormal brain being used in the creature. Notice the language I'm using, creature, and I think that's much more accurate than saying monster. The creation is not monstrous. We could debate that with the film, but even the film portrays the creature in a somewhat sympathetic manner. I always think about the drowning girl scene, which again is different in the text itself. I hope you've gotten up to that point in the text, where ultimately, even though there are differences, the intent is very similar, that the creature just is looking for friendship and doesn't understand the consequences of its actions. And of course, he's brutalized and hunted for it. I would suggest the true monster is humanity as a whole that continues to reject the creature merely because of its appearance. Certainly, that's one of the themes that's embedded in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But even in the film version of the Frankenstein, think about how he shows his fear of fire and how he's tortured and tormented through that. So I think that Boris Karloff, the actor who was playing Frankenstein, gave Frankenstein a very empathetic element, so that we could get perhaps a sense of one of the major themes that Mary Shelley was trying to give us in her particular novel. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the papers because I know that you are probably curious about that. And then I wanted to begin talking about Frankenstein. As you know, we have multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. My hope is that at this point you are firmly embedded in the text. Perhaps you've even finished the text at this point. I always suggest that you read ahead. What would be ideal is if you have put closure onto Frankenstein, you can begin our next text, which is Edgar Allan Poe, or hopefully you will put closure onto Frankenstein soon enough so that you can begin Poe. When we talk about Poe, then you're moving on to the next text. So if you'll see in the video below where I've posted our class notes in the second section, it says paper. And according to our syllabus and course outline, that first paper is due by October 25th. Now, I chose that date because that's approximately midway through the semester. But I have what I call a rolling deadline. In other words, that you can submit in that paper at any point starting from now until the 25th of October. So as soon as you feel inspired, you can hand in that paper. And over the course of the next several classes, I'll be talking about some paper writing techniques as well so that you could embed within your paper. Keep in mind that everybody has the option of rewriting this first paper. So when you hand it in, I'll evaluate it for grammar and for content and return it back to you with a letter grade. If you're content with your letter grade, then you're done with the exercise. If you want to try to improve your grade, I ask that you incorporate my comments into a revision. If you're still uncertain how to proceed, then feel free to contact me and we could talk about it further. And I ask that you submit in that revision along with the original graded copy with my comments on it so I can compare and contrast the two. And then you get the higher of the two grades. And as I was mentioning earlier, professional authors get editorial commentary and support. So I don't think that I'm in any way doing something that's unusual by allowing you the opportunity to rewrite. So everybody has that option. That revision would be due by the last day of class. So you've got some time to work on it. Obviously, the sooner you hand it in, the better off everyone is. Now, your second paper is going to be due by the ending of the semester. And if you hand that paper in by the ending of the semester, then there obviously isn't time for a revision. But the second paper also has a rolling deadline, and you can hand in the second paper at any point after you've handed in your first paper, and I've returned it back to you. And that means that if you could get in that second paper on time, or early enough, I should say, that we could negotiate about the possibility of a revision. It's not guaranteed. It's something that we would need to talk about. But the first paper is guaranteed for everyone. I see the first paper as a learning exercise, if you will. And my hope, as I said, is that everybody will have that paper in by the 25th. Now, if you don't, certainly you can ask for an extension, but I'm beginning to get a little bit anxious because we are halfway through the semester and you don't have your paper in yet. So, and I can tell you that the second half of the semester just flies by. So, Paper number 1 is going to be addressing the earlier set of readings of the semester. What that means for us in terms of Gothic literature, either Frankenstein, which we're in the midst of now, Poe's short stories, which we will be reading soon, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And paper number 2 would be dealing with the latter set of readings, and that would be Lovecraft and his short stories, or The Haunting of Hill House, or The Exorcist. If you look in the syllabus and other documents folder, you will see that I have put a paper topic handout there that talks about paper number 1 and paper number 2. And I'm going to read from that handout right now. That paper number 1 and paper number 2 will be critical papers. In other words, you should not be consulting outside resources. So this is something that I always used to do because I really wanted to focus on critical reading skills so that you would compile what you've learned over the course of the semester through class and through discussions and through writing assignments and so forth. I'm even firmer in my belief now that we have artificial intelligence. So I would like you to focus on your own thoughts. I would like you to use your own language. That really is the best way to learn. Paper length, approximate, or at least in this particular class, which is a writing and a reading class. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately means approximately, as long as it needs to be in order to support your particular point. That said, I understand why students ask about paper length because it gives them an idea of how much time and effort to put into that particular assignment. So I can say that most people write about 4 to 5 pages, the traditional formatting of double-spaced 1-inch margins. This is discussed in our syllabus. Now, one of the things I've done this semester that's different from semesters past is I've changed around the option for the paper topic. I wanted to do something that perhaps would rely more on your reasoning than it would on an outside resource. And again, I don't want you to use outside resources. I want you to rely on yourself. That said, while I have a topic for you, which I'm going to talk about momentarily, you can also write on your own topic. So you can create a topic, but you must approve that topic with me beforehand. So if you wanted to start thinking about topics right now, certainly you can let me know. So one of the things that you might have noticed when I was talking about paper number 1 addressing Frankenstein, Poe, or Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, or paper 2 addressing Lovecraft, Haunting of Hill House, or The Exorcist, is I left out Dracula. Dracula straddles the mid part of the semester. So Dracula, because of that, can be examined either in paper number 1 or paper number 2. You don't want to have 2 papers devoted to Dracula. So that said, I suspect that you would probably want to think about Dracula for the second paper just because of the dates of when our readings occur. We won't have closure on Dracula by the time that I'm hoping you get your first paper in, which would be midway through the semester, which happens to be the 25th. And I suggest that certainly while you can write a paper on anything, it makes sense that we first have class about the text before you actually submit in a paper to me about that text, because they will probably be learning that will go on. So at least I certainly hope so. So this is the topic, and again, this is something different than what I've done in the past, but I decided to choose one of my favorite quotes. I think I might have shared with you that I'm working on a book. I'm writing a book on horror film, and actually the book begins with this quote. It's a quote from an author that you might be aware of and familiar with. I suspect you are. Emily Dickinson. After all, she's local, Amherst. And the quote comes from her poem. "One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a chamber to be haunted." So this is the topic. Examine how the following quote by Emily Dickinson, quote, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted," unquote, applies to the text you have selected for your paper. Again, for the first paper, my suspicion is that you will either be writing about Frankenstein or something about Edgar Allan Poe. You might want to talk about just one short story in depth, or perhaps compare and contrast two. And or you might want to talk about even 3, but you want to make sure that you're doing a good detailed analysis. So 3 might be pushing it. It depends on what you do. And your last option would probably be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with again the possibility of Dracula, but understanding that we would be in the midst of Dracula midway through this semester. So regardless of whether or not you choose this particular topic or you create your own, and again, it must be approved by me, you need to provide textual evidence and details to support your arguments. So this is something that we will be talking about in the following classes, using evidence and details from the text. I oftentimes liken it to being an attorney, that your job as an attorney is to gather all of the evidence for your case, so to speak, that you're making. In this particular instance, it's about how the quote, "one need not be a chamber to be haunted," applies to the text. So you can begin thinking about this now for something like Frankenstein, for instance. And you'll note that at the bottom of this handout, I have a quote that I state basically that a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, "Have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible," unquote. You'll see that I have parentheses following that quote with the author's surname and a page number, which is the convention for quoting in the MLA system, or Modern Language Association system, which we use in the humanities and in literature. I'm hopeful this is something that you've talked about in your previous English class, but we will also talk about it in the future. You can see as well that I was very careful to use square brackets for the term "or has the author," because that was not part of the original quote. That was my insertion into the quote. And that's also a convention of writing, that if you are inserting your own language into a quote, usually you do this to clarify, not necessarily to explain the quote itself. That you can do before or after the quote. You use square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets. So, in this particular instance, this is a tall order to say something as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible. Or as I had a very wise professor in college once say, a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. So, that said, I encourage you to start right now thinking about what you might write about and how to write it clearly, concisely, believably, and gracefully. And I can tell you that most people begin in a way that makes the exercise more difficult for them. They try to write the perfect first sentence, and they try to write the paper in one sitting, and that's usually quite ineffective. A much better way is to write the paper over stages and pieces, and not to focus on language initially. Focus on content, generate ideas. And then you can go back and polish that language. Doing it over a series of days or weeks, you usually end up with a much better paper. So again, we'll talk about some of the conventions of paper writing over the next several classes, but I wanted to give you that topic and encourage you to hand in early papers, of course with the understanding that you could always rewrite your paper for a higher grade. So I'll revisit the idea of papers as we continue on, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Frankenstein, the text itself, rather than just talking about the film. You can see this in the notes below in the 3rd section. The opening page of Frankenstein, which might be something that you might be tempted to skip, is incredibly important because it sets the tone. Notice that Frankenstein is not the full name of the novel. It's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. And you need to know your mythology in order to understand that reference. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind, and he was punished for his hubris, for his excessive pride for doing so. This is going to be important, this context, for us understanding characters that we will be introduced to in the Frankenstein novel. For instance, Victor Frankenstein himself. Or even Walton, which is how the novel begins. Again, I was talking about the epistolary novel, which is a novel that's told in letters. It was not an unusual way for people to communicate at that time. I guess it would be comparable to, in today's day, having a novel set up in text messages, for instance. And We have a Robert Walton, who's a sea captain, who's writing to his sister. Notice how she's referenced as Mrs. Seville. Again, this is very indicative of how gender was viewed at the time period, that female would be viewed as property of male, and in marriage, that would be the most important status that she would have, her married status. And in the first letter, Walton talks about how I prefer glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path. So this is going to set up some of the ways that he's exhibited hubris or excessive ambition. And there are going to be lots of parallels with Victor Frankenstein himself when we are introduced to Victor Frankenstein. Going back to that opening page of Frankenstein, you'll notice that Mary Shelley, quite well read, and oftentimes we quote from literary texts. There will be important references to a text known as Paradise Lost, an epic poem written by John Milton in the 1700s. And basically, I can at least summarize the poem for you, that it's supposed to be about the biblical story of the fall of mankind through the devil's temptation in the Garden of Eden with the apple. And that said, while that's supposed to be the primary story, when you read this epic poem, it's considered one of the greatest poems ever read. And it is the length of a novel, which is why it's an epic poem. You get quite a bit of detail about Satan. And Satan is presented as a rather sympathetic, even empathetic kind of character. And that Satan is created by God to be majestic and then ignored by God when God creates a new creation, which happens to be mankind. This is going to be important in terms of understanding some of the themes in the novel that will be coming up. For instance, how the creature feels over his creation. And I can tell you right now that as iconic as Frankenstein is, and it's a well-written text when you think about the fact that Mary Shelley was so young. She was in 19 or so when she was writing this. I certainly couldn't have done something at that age, nor could do it at my current age. But that's not to say that there aren't problems in the text. So I hope you've gotten far enough into the text so that you could see the scene where the creature not only teaches itself how to read, but it also finds, by happenstance, a series of books in a satchel that are some of the greatest works of literature and history. And this is how he learns about the human condition. And again, we have to suspend quite a bit of disbelief for this. And Shelley will provide us with some plot details explaining how this might go about if you haven't gotten to that point yet. My hope is that if you haven't gotten to that point, you will certainly by the weekend. So I'm deliberately doing this, giving you a little bit of extra time to get through Frankenstein. In the second letter, Walton says, I have no friend, Margaret. Unvisited regions I am about to explore. This is usually a bad thing in the Gothic, the idea of being isolated, being alone. Basically, safety and happiness comes through community. And this is a theme we'll see over and over again. It's one of the messages in the text. This idea that Walton is examining unvisited regions, he's trying to make new geographic discoveries. This is also going to parallel Victor Frankenstein, who is also looking at unvisited regions. In this instance, he's trying to make life from death. We'll talk about some of his motivations as the next couple of classes progress. And in his third letter, Walton asks, what can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? Now, this is similar to another literary text that oftentimes is important in the Gothic tradition. It's called Dr. Faustus. I believe I might have mentioned this text in a previous class, where this was written by Christopher Marlowe, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. And it happens to be based on a German story, but the British story of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus is about a man named Dr. Faustus, I guess that's not surprising, who has achieved every accolade that he could in all of learning. medicine and art and history and all of the rest, law and so forth, theology. So he is, well, for lack of a better word, bored. So he ends up making a deal with the devil so that he can gain unlimited knowledge, knowledge that's not available to humankind. And it's probably not a spoiler alert that when you make a deal with the devil, it doesn't go well, which is what the play is about. And that Faustus, first of all, I'm not so sure gets unlimited knowledge. It seems like he's rather cheated. But regardless, the knowledge that Faustus does get, he squanders. Rather than using it initially, he has all these grandiose notions that he wants to make men live eternally and cure illness and so forth and so on. And in the end, he's just playing pranks on people because he's been given information on how to make himself, or knowledge about how to make himself invisible. And then at the very ending of the play, this is when it's time for Faustus to give up his soul, because he sold his soul to the devil for unlimited knowledge. And it's at this point that Faustus wants to repent, but it's too little too late. And throughout the play, he contemplates repenting, and he always has an excuse, either that I've got more time later, so let me have fun now, or the idea that I'm too sinful to get God's forgiveness, therefore I may as well enjoy myself now. So, and there is a moral that's embedded in that story, much like we talked about Gothic literature has a moral. And keep this in the back of your mind as well when we're talking about Victor, who wants the knowledge that is forbidden. After all, we know how Prometheus stole fire and was punished by the gods for it. Victor is also trying to get forbidden knowledge, how to make life from death. And there will be consequences to that. So we continue on thinking about the fourth letter. And so we're still not even in the story proper yet. Walton talks about how he ran across Victor, and that Victor was traveling the seas, much like Walton is, but he wasn't a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. You will definitely see a Eurocentric bias in this particular text, because Shelley is a product of her times. And the idea that European is superior is something that's embedded in this text. And this is where Walter and Victor begin talking with one another and realize that they have a good number of similarities. And Victor says to Walton, I sought for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Unhappy man, do you share my madness? So the idea is that Victor is going to school Walton in the dangers of excessive ambition. That Victor has a story about how it led to his destruction, and perhaps Walton will learn something from this particular story. And we talk about in letter 4 that Victor is a slave of passion, this idea of mastery and servitude, or being a slave to one's emotions, is something that you oftentimes see embedded within literature as well, that you need to have balance. But finally, we get Victor's story in chapter 1. And it's very easy to forget when we are reading Victor's story, because Victor is talking in the I, and supposedly Walton is writing all of this down exactly the way Victor has detailed it. And Walton's doing so at the ending of the day. There's all kinds of problems here. We already know that Walton is in a poor state physically. He's on the edge of a mutiny with his crew. We know that Walton hasn't eaten. We know that also Walton is psychologically distressed. Add to all of that the length of time from when Walton gets the information from Victor to when he transcribes it, supposedly word for word. So there could be lots of errors in the text. In fact, there have even been questions about whether or not Victor is even real, or could this be a figment of Walton's imagination, again considering his psychological and his physical state. So this is an interesting question when you get an epistolary novel, when you're getting things in letters, is that you don't necessarily know the truth because you don't have an omniscient narrator. And in this particular instance, we have only one narrator throughout the entire novel, even though it sounds like we've got multiple narrators. And that narrator is Walton. Because Walton is basically telling his sister, that's the context that we're given, that's the frame, what he has been given by this strange traveler that he's taken aboard his ship. To make things even more complicated, if you've gotten to this point, that eventually Victor will tell the creature story, and it'll be through the eye. And that said, we're not getting the creature's version. We're not getting we're not getting Victor's version. We're only getting Walton's version of what Victor has told him about what the creature has told him. So we get narrative embedded in narrative embedded in narrative. So the truth is not clear. So even if Victor does exist, we know that Victor too is in a bad place physically and emotionally by the time he's picked up by Walton. Could the creature be a figment of Victor's imagination? Something to consider. Now, that said, usually the novel is written as having the characters, or the novel is interpreted as having the characters of Victor and Walton, and also the creature, so that we can examine all three as entities. But if you wanted to talk about the idea of uncertain narration, certainly that's an element of this particular text. Victor's story, there's a good amount of irony here. In the first chapter, he talks about how he's loved by his parents, and I love the language he uses. I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child. And that's something he's not able to transfer over to his own creation. In fact, he ignores all responsibility to the creation, Victor, that is. And that's the second mistake Victor makes. The first is creating life from death, and the second is abandoning that life. And think about all the possible modern day parallels about not living up to one's parental responsibility and what the consequences are upon the child and how the child is ultimately influenced by that. Not that Mary Shelley knew it, but there also are lots of scientific parallels. Just think about the idea of cloning, something like creating life, and what are the ethical and moral consequences of that. We learn from Victor that someone was adopted into his family. There's going to be lots of references to motherless children throughout this text. The child was thin and very fair, and her name is Elizabeth, and he talks about the reason why his family chose her because of her European features. Again, we see that European bias embedded within the text. And that she basically was to be Victor's and Victor's only, that she was a kind of prize, which would not be unusual at the time period for a female to be viewed as something to be given to male. And while Victor talks about her as a kind of sister or cousin, they're not blood related. So that said, a union would be perfectly appropriate and even acceptable, because in this social station, you wanted to make sure that you maintained your station or improved it. In fact, when we get to Edgar Allan Poe, we'll talk about how you could be a blood relation, let's say cousins, and still marry. And in fact, I think that still exists in a couple of states in the United States. And Victor talks about how the world to him, this is a quote, was a secret which I desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired. And of course, he wants to know the unknown secrets about what he should not know about. And there will be negative consequences of this. And I love how Victor throughout talks about how he feels like he's guilty of a crime. Well, he is guilty of multiple crimes, but he refuses to accept responsibility for that. Chapter 5, which we will revisit next class in more detail, is that creation scene that is so iconic, set in the dreary night of November. So everything we've talked about in terms of the Gothic, in terms of setting atmosphere and tone and mood, we get in that creation scene. One of the ways that I mentioned that perhaps we have to suspend disbelief is how the creature learns how to read, which is a little bit absurd. Even before that, in chapter 6, Elizabeth talks a little bit to Victor through letters, of course, because everybody is communicating through letters, about a family member or somebody who was accepted into their family, even though she's not a blood relation, Justine. And says, Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours. And I always chuckle at that line, because if this person, Justine, was really a favorite of Victor's, he wouldn't need to be reminded of that. This is for us as audience. So again, there's some places in the text where perhaps Shelley isn't as smooth as she could be. And what we will discuss is that Justine ultimately confesses to a crime that she never committed. It turns out that it's the creature who committed that crime. And we have to talk about why the creature was motivated to commit a crime, murdering William, Victor's brother, and why it is that the creature tries to frame Justine, and why it is that Justine ultimately accepts the blame even though she's innocent, and why it is that Victor doesn't speak up, even though he knows, or at least he's quite suspicious, that Justine is innocent and it's the creature who's run amok, at least from Victor's perspective at this point. When we get to chapter 9, we start getting the creature story, and remember, or when we get to chapter 9, we start getting Walton's story from the creature, or when we get to chapter 9, we start getting Victor's story from the creature, depending on what perspective you want. This creature is quite articulate. One of the questions we have, and this might be something that you've talked about perhaps in a philosophy class, the difference between nature and nurture. Are we born as a kind of blank slate, a tabula rasa, and basically our environment influences us? That's nurture. Or is it nature, that it's embedded within our DNA, if you will, to be a particular way? And usually it's viewed as a combination of the two. And this is something that we'll examine with the creature who is created. And from our initial impressions of the creature, or someone who appreciates nature, and I would say that that's central in the text as well, as I was suggesting earlier, that those passages that Percy Shelley had encouraged Mary Shelley to add about nature aren't just convention for the time period, but the idea of the appreciation of nature is supposed to show an element of humanity, one that the creature has that perhaps Victor and the others don't. Notice that Victor is always in a rather poor state when he isolates himself, especially from the natural world. When he's enveloped with nature, he's usually in a much better state physically and emotionally. And the creature is engaged in rather benevolent activities at first. He tries to help others. He teaches itself language. He uses reason. And ultimately, it gets a hold of Paradise Lost, reads it, understands it. Again, we have to suspend disbelief. And compares itself both to Satan, who was rejected by God, and also compares himself to Adam, who is also rejected by God, just because of his curiosity or his knowledge. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going on in the text. And something else to consider. We've got a female author who's writing a very male-centric text. So I would suggest that there is a lesson that's embedded in this text. What happens when you isolate and exclude female? Terrible things, as we see with Walton and we see with Victor. And might I also suggest, although it seems on the surface that we don't have a central female character, yes, we've got Elizabeth, yes, we've got Justine, but they seem to be rather minor characters who are also somewhat passive. But we'll talk a little bit more about them. That said, when we get to the character of Safety, who's later on in the novel, she's less passive, but we'll talk about that. Might I suggest that nature is usually viewed as female, the feminine? And if that's the case, then the central female character in this novel is nature and the natural world. And again, reinforcing the idea of what happens when you exclude nature or the mother, the universal mother. Note that Victor, in creating his creature, is taking on the role of mother without female. Something else for us to consider. So, the attendance question that I'm going to ask for today, and this will be due on our discussion form by Friday the 23rd. However, feel free to ask for an extension if necessary, but at this point you definitely should have started the book. So even if you haven't finished reading the book, you should be able to answer this question. Identify an important quote in Frankenstein and why it's important. So based on what you've read thus far, identify an important quote in Frankenstein and why it's important. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but I encourage you to respond to your peers. You are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn, because I read all of the responses and I respond back. And this is supposed to try to mimic what we would have discussed in a class discussion. So I'm curious to see what quotes you all choose and why. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will continue on discussing Frankenstein. Take care. Bye bye.